Hi there, and welcome to Social Capital Matters. I'm your host, Kylie Taylor. On this show, we take a deep dive into the ideas around social capital by talking to business and industry leaders about how they use it to inspire their stakeholders and build a framework for long-term success. Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of Social Capital Matters. We have a great show for you this week, but first, let me introduce my producer, Greg, in Bangkok. How are you, Greg? Are you there?
Hi, Kylie. I'm doing fine. It's great that we're doing another call with someone on the other side of the world. You're in Australia, I'm here in Bangkok, and our guest today is in London. So let's go ahead and meet them.
Excellent. Today, I'm talking to Dylan Tanner, the Executive Director and co-founder of InfluenceMap, a non-profit think tank providing objective analysis of how companies and financial institutions are impacting the climate and diversity crisis. Now based in London, Dylan grew up in Japan and has a long history of technical advisory and consulting work globally and in particular throughout Asia on projects covering environmental audits, corporate sustainability, and climate strategy. So let's get right into it. Dylan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you, Kylie.
Now, most of us are on a rapid learning curve when it comes to sustainability. Someone said to me a little while ago, hey, do we really need to know all of this because we don't work in sustainability? And, to me, the answer is yes. We all work in sustainability, so we all need to know this stuff. If you're a strategic communications professional today, working either as a consultant, as I do and my colleagues do, or working in-house for a corporate, you are working in sustainability. The future of organizations is predicated on how they're going to step up to the expectations of all their stakeholders. And that means stepping up to expectations around all aspects of ESG, because ESG is the critical lens that many stakeholders are using to evaluate companies. And, with everything that I'm doing, that couldn't be more true. The world we're in, though, is set for discrepancies. It's getting more and more confusing for those of us who are not focused on this full time. And if I just looked at 2023, it was an incredibly eventful year. And I think it's fair to say that for anyone like me looking at this, there's a plethora of new acronyms that come up every single day. And some people are just being left a bit dazed and confused and don't know where to start. So with that background in mind, I thought it would be great to have a conversation with Dylan about this. Dylan, I'm really fascinated by what you're doing and how you go about it. Can you tell me more about why you co-founded InfluenceMap and what you're doing, and what is it that you do that other organizations don't do?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kylie. Yeah, and I share your not confusion, but this plethora of acronyms sort of emerged. And if I can just say, I encountered sustainability in ESG about 25 years ago when I set up an environmental consultancy in Japan and Asia. And back then, the issue was how do we comply with the law and still make money for companies? It was all about compliance and whatnot. And then ESG emerged and sustainability emerged. And that created somewhat of a new paradigm for companies that were used to just complying with law and not having to worry about things that they needed to do but weren't in compliance. Yeah. But so I think that the world is now shifting in the ESG. Some of the issues within ESG are now business critical issues, and that's what InfluenceMap studies climate change. And this is no longer for many companies just another ESG or sustainability issue. And so we set it up as at the request of the investment community that didn't have enough information, or they felt disclosures from companies were not sufficient to really understand corporate behavior on climate change. And the particular issue that they wanted to know more about was how are companies impacting the system and climate policy. And this is a very, very poorly disclosed topic in general from companies.
Now, you do a lot more than just reading sustainability reports. I know you go beyond that. How do you actually go about collecting and compiling data at InfluenceMap? What's involved?
So it's all in the public domain, and it's all legitimate information that either the companies have communicated to governments, or the companies are communicating to the world via their own websites or communications, and or it's reliable media transcripts of what the senior management of companies have said or done. So we're using multi-channel information sources, some of them obtained by freedom of information requests,
Right.
and combining these together to get a more accurate picture of the behavior of the company than is otherwise available through scant disclosure on this topic.
Right. Okay. Now, you're operating across many different countries and many different jurisdictions, and with distinct rating agencies operating in different regions, employing different criteria, investors, regulators, even customers having their own expectations. The scene is set for a lot of discrepancies or different ways of looking at the same information, maybe even. And so there's always going to be concerns about reliability or transparency or conflicts of interest, or people just being very selective with the information that they put out there. How do you navigate that to make sure your information and your findings are as robust as they can be? Is it just a matter of scale and finding as much information as possible?
I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that the whole ESG ratings, the whole ESG disclosure is undergoing a transformation. And the value of a single ESG metric for a company is becoming more in doubt, because it's such a blend of many, many issues. I think the key to our metric is that it's very specific and highly relevant for the topic that we choose to study, which is climate change, which is now blowing up to being one of the biggest societal issues, and certainly it's often the defining ESG issue for investors and for many companies. ESG equals climate change in many cases, and plus nature as well. But so therefore our metric, even though it's very, very niche, suddenly now rears its head as one of the most important for certainly for investors to understand corporate behavior.
All right, I probably couldn't have this conversation with you without talking about COP28 a few months ago. You were at COP28. And, I think there, more than ever, we saw a huge number of corporates getting involved. You were there. You mentioned to me you saw a lot of corporate lobbying and so forth going on. And I found it really fascinating, the sort of tug of war around the final statements that came out. And we had one version of the statement that the president of COP28 was going to put out, and then it was adjusted a little bit, and then it came out again separately. And this is, of course, I'm talking about the fossil fuel just transition statement that came out at the end of that. You were there. You saw some of these machinations going on, I guess, behind the scenes and center stage. Did you leave that event feeling optimistic about the future? How did you feel?
So I've been to quite a few of these, so I don't take such huge stride from one particular. It's like you're seeing a direction of travel.
Yeah.
And it was very significant in that the phrase phase out of fossil fuels was in place.
Yeah.
And that's been something that the whole world, the whole scientific and civil society community has been trying to strive for. So that's something, and that will be used by investors, others to challenge new fossil fuel development projects which are being proposed. In parallel with that whole COP process, which is 28, and I was at COP 3 in Kyoto, so and some of them in between.
Yes,
is now a whole burgeoning kind of non-state actor set of processes going on, and they meet at every COP, and it's almost like a parallel set of activities, and those ones are very promising and growing and really influential. And one of the most interesting things for me was this whole unification of the renewable energy industry, which otherwise has been fragmented and now under a big campaign which is called Double Down, Triple Up, renewable energy by 2030, and which will hasten, if that happens, the phase out of fossil fuels, because it's not a zero sum game. You only have so many power stations that need building and so many cars that need driving. So if you have EVs and renewable energy, then that will impact demand for fossil fuels. So that's a great outcome and a great set of things to get involved in, aside from this kind of international level stuff, which is often a marketing kind of activity and a negotiation thing that's slow.
Yeah. I heard an interview with Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever, and obviously a larger than life actor in this particular space. And one of the things he was talking about, and it's something that you talk about too, about the great power imbalance that the large corporations have. And he said in that space, there are good actors and there are bad actors amongst the companies. There are some corporations that will only ever push their vested interests, and others really try to collaborate with government and other stakeholders to deliver better outcomes for society. How do you figure out which is which as a consumer or as a customer or even as an investor and the people that you work with? Is it your analysis of organizations that help sort out who are the good actors and the bad actors? Can I simplify it that much?
So we know Paul Polman well. He when he was CEO of Unilever, he was engaged with our data and used it to impact his own company, Unilever. But I think one of the things we try and do is create scorecards. So 500 companies ranked A through F. Yeah. And below that, there's a whole bunch of data and an analysis to justify that score. So certainly investors can get engaged with that data and identify good actors and bad actors, and that's the purpose of our data. And they use it to have deep engagements with companies, and companies try and improve their scores. And we say the only way you can improve your score is improve your performance. No amount of disclosure on your sustainability report will help out in that respect. So one thing we'd like to do is to allow the wider public to understand the importance of the issue of corporate engagement with policy and society and the system, and that's something is a challenge for us.
I want to just jump to a related topic. In this podcast series, I also talked to a corporate affairs and sustainability lead for BASF in the region. And we had a really good discussion, because one of the things I put to him was that, well, you know, I've seen some ratings that InfluenceMap have done on BASF, and you know, you didn't come out so strongly. And what's your reaction to that? Marko Jeličić from BASF, you know, explained it to me and said, well, you know, BASF, we're a really large corporation. We've got many parts to our corporation. Some are moving faster than others. Others are at a much lower rate of maturity, and there's more work to do. He was well aware of the poorer rating that they'd had from InfluenceMap, and he, you know, suggested to me that he didn't think some of the analysis was detailed enough or thorough enough. I don't really want to just dive into the BASF example and put you on the spot, but what do you do when you come up against that? Do you come up against companies, you know, disagreeing with your ratings, or are the facts the facts?
The facts are the facts. What we come up against is exactly what the person from BASF articulated. Companies want us to blend, I guess, internal strategy and internal CapEx and other issues into our rating. And they say, well, listen, this is a long transition. This is what we're doing now. And we push back on that because we think there's already enough systems to measure how the pathways towards decarbonization or emissions profile of companies is. That's what all of the other ESG systems do. So our job is to take out the policy engagement aspect, which is usually decided at the corporate level, not fragmented around the world by these big companies, and say this is an important metric so users can understand what the company is thinking right now in real time about the energy transition. Is it fighting all these government regulations and therefore it's probably not on board with the capex and the emissions reduction plans as much as other companies. So we do see a difference in the same sector, like in utilities or automotive. Some companies are pushing governments to act more fast, so their business models will have an advantage, while others are fighting it, so they can cling on to their, brown assets for longer. So it's an important metric for that purpose, and it shouldn't be blended in with something other and then lose its value.
I can't imagine any other organisation other than yours that would have studied as much sustainability information and sustainability reports on a whole range of companies. So I just wanted to talk about the whole idea of superficiality for a moment. We come across lots of organisations and, they want to do a good job, but it's got to be more than just a tick box exercise. Do you just, and I know this is very sort of macro, sort of broad sweeping statement, but do you think that a large number of companies are really getting it now and moving beyond the superficial box ticking, or do you still see a lot of that going on?
I think putting myself in a sustainability function of a company, having to disclose the stuff and deal with all of these different standards, it is a huge challenge. I do think that the tick box things is still there in some sectors and some companies. But I do think many companies are really trying hard to understand the multiple and often conflicting demands from multiple stakeholders and report on that in a way that's both honest, but also in a way that's beneficial to the company. And that's a balance that needs to be had. But I do think there's a role for data providers and think tanks like us that do not ask the companies for disclosure. They just report on what we see. And that's an important kind of challenge to push the companies as well.
Now, what about the role of rating agencies? There are a whole range of firms that will provide some type of rating service and rating agency. Then, on the same hand, they can actually sell you services to help you get a better rating next time and help you review your work. Am I looking at this in a too much of a simplified way, or does that still go on? And is that how it works?
I have heard that they do have consulting arms. I do think that there needs to be Chinese walls between those. It is a conflict of interest potentially. In the same manner that in the great financial crisis, you had the rating agencies accepting money to award AAA status to various bonds. So that needs to be taken care of. But I mean, that's sort of the wider companies are paying auditors to audit their accounts. And so it's hard to avoid that. But I do think you pointed out a good case of you have a ratings agency, which they're making money from selling to investors, and then they're setting up a side business helping the companies improve their score, which is an issue. But I mean, I don't think that's something that's. I think the main issue with these ESG ratings is that they're blending too many issues and relying simply on disclosure reports from the companies for their data sources.
Right. Okay. Like the example that we talked about previously.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you to explain for a minute this whole of system approach. When I chatted to you previously, it really resonated with me when you talked about the fact that organisations need to look beyond their own operations and look at their impact on the whole system. And that, to me, just made incredible common sense. And I just thought, wow, that's a really important conversation that more people need to be having and more organizations need to be thinking about. So maybe I could just ask you to explain what you mean by this whole of system approach and maybe give an example or two.
So what we're told by Unilever, I don't want to put them on a pedestal or anything, but they went down their path of how do we create a transition plan around climate and make sure that we can implement that in these many countries that we operate, which is everywhere. And they soon found that actually the barrier they were hitting was lack of government guidance and policy in many of those countries to implement that plan. And this is something that many large multinationals are finding, particularly, the first stages of decarbonization is how do we procure renewable energy around the world for our global operations. And big tech companies, for example, were we're hitting barriers associated with policy. So I think in the last couple of years, and accelerated in the last year, is this understanding for corporate leadership on climate and ESG requires robust and purposeful engagement on the policy side of things in a manner that's not only beneficial to the company, but also in line with science-based policy. And that's a catchphrase. It's not a catchphrase. That's something that's emerging as complementing science-based targets and stuff, which you're probably familiar with.
Yes.
In terms of emissions reduction. Well, this is what the IPCC is saying about the future of the world's pathways towards 1.5C. Companies have now sometimes more power than many governments individually in swaying that policy, and that they perhaps have a need to do it to implement their plans, and at best like an obligation to do this for their wider kind of thriving in the system, I guess, is the way many companies put it.
I like the fact that the facts are the facts. Like once you get to the facts behind something, and, my understanding of your work at InfluenceMap is, you are looking to be one clear source of the truth, if you like, for the various audiences that are relying on your reports and on your benchmarking, your ratings. And I think the whole idea of truth today is very important. And we spend a lot of time around, I like to think of it as the 3 T's around truth, transparency, and trust. Now, I think, those 3 words would be would resonate very strongly with you in your business, because that's exactly what you're trying to get to. You're trying to get to the truth. You're trying to get more transparency, and you're trying to sort of build trust. How, looking at this from a corporate point of view, from what you've seen, what could corporates be doing better to achieve higher standards? I mean, when we talked about the BASF example, you said, if you want a higher ranking or higher rating, do better. Just go and do better, perform better. Is it that simple, or is there anything else that people, or when I say people, companies could be doing to achieve more around truth, trust, and transparency?
Of those, that's a really elegant way of putting that, and I think that the trust part of those 3 T's is the most difficult for companies, and maybe it's what they strive to attain from their stakeholders in their brand and in their activities. In the case of, I'll kind of apply this to InfluenceMap. In the truth side of things, our kind of North Star is the scientific community's consensus on climate change. And we, from the very beginning, said, look, we're not going to input our own opinions into this.
Right.
They matter, but in the grand scheme of things, we have 10,000 plus scientists who've worked this out. That's the truth. And we analyze the IPCC statements and they're getting more specific. So the truth is becoming more indisputable. And that's great. And that our team loves that. And that's our audience likes that. It's very elegant. And then there's a transparency side where we put out all of our stuff we do in the public domain, including our methodology. And that has therefore built up trust amongst investors, companies, and others in the credibility of our data. So I think that applies to any situation and with companies as well. Look at what the science says on climate change and nature, and it's you don't need more studies, more information. There is enough information there in the benchmarks and the guidance, and then be transparent about how you're engaging with that truth. So the ETs you mentioned are not difficult to understand. It's just how to deal with some of the conflicts within the company about their priorities, their short-term gains and losses, and then the stuff that the 3 T's that you mentioned says about the system.
You mentioned that the science is there. We've got the science today. We've got the information to work with. Do you think it's a matter of more people, potentially on the corporate side, getting more familiar with the science? Is it about coming up the curve and actually really understanding it more? Is it a knowledge gap sometimes that causes the issue.
Yeah, it is, and it's also the knowledge is changing. I mean, the actual facts are becoming more clear and apparent, and it's becoming more clear what the timelines are.
Right.
And because I don't think that this is the day job of most corporate executives running companies, there is a need for some more high level explanation of what what does the IEA and the IPCC, that's the scientific communities dealing with the energy transition, say needs to happen around climate change. And this should be maybe given to them in a 10-point or 5-point bullet point thing about transport, energy, agriculture, land use, whatever. And this should be common knowledge for anyone running a big company, and they should be debriefed regularly on this, because it's going to catch the companies up if they don't know this, or they don't implement it, or they implement something which is counter to this.
Yes.
And increasingly, all CEOs are being asked about how their company is dealing with climate change. So if they make reference to these touch points, they're going to be ahead of the game.
I think that is a good point, because I think a lot of people who sort of have day jobs, if you like, I mean, I'd like to think we're all in sustainability and we've got to all be thinking about it. But in reality, people have day jobs that are operational or leadership, and they're not always thinking about it. And the people I speak to often, I get this feedback of just information overwhelm. There's so much stuff out there. I don't know what I should be reading. I don't know where I should go to. And you just made the point that, yes, it'd be great if it was in a 10-point plan or a regular briefing or something like that. Is there, and look, I just wanted to throw this out, do you have a one place to go to read up on things that you think is the best source of information if we wanted to be well informed but not overwhelmed?
I would say there is a 5-page statement from the IPCC, which is guidance to policymakers, which contains a whole bunch of stuff about what needs to happen to different sectors of the economy to save the world from climate change, essentially. And that can be further condensed into one page.
Right. Dylan, at the end of our podcast, we always like to ask our guest if there's any particular parting thoughts or things that they would want to share with us that we haven't covered. I'd really like to end by asking you any particular advice you would have for corporate leaders who don't want to be box tickers and want to do better. How can they get things right? And maybe 2 parts to this. How can consumers and other stakeholders train themselves to do a little bit of what you do, to look beyond the window dressing and look beyond sort of marketing slogans and so forth, and look behind things? I mean, we don't all have the resources that you've got to do the huge, well-researched job, but is there a way sort of mere mortals can actually be a bit more switched on and more questioning when they see statements about green products or services or organisations? So sorry, that was a bit of a 2-part thing. What can corporates do better, and what can us mere mortals do to be more questioning of information?
So for corporate leaders, what I would say is you have more power than you realize to make an impact on this issue through your positions in the companies and the company's ability to impact the system.
Yeah.
And so they're in a position of privilege right now to make a change, or to be part of this process of change in a very assertive and honest way. And it goes back to that issue of truth. And, there's an issue you mentioned is there's so many sources of information. And if you don't know much about it, or you want to, and you go on, you almost need a guide to help with that information. So maybe find that. And then also keep in mind that the IPCC is the North Star.
Right.
This is the scientists who've been saying this is what needs to happen. And that kind of applies to consumers as well, because for them, they don't have this guide. They can't pay a consultant or whatever. And so it's even more bewildering because there's just so many different green guides and so much misinformation on the internet. And I would say the same thing. Look at the IPCC and read that summary to get an understanding of what the truth is.
Yeah.
And don't be so mistrustful of governments all the time. This is an issue that we're facing, that the system has encouraged so much mistrust and rightly so in some of the political developments around the world. But in terms of regulators and scientists within governments, they by and large are trying to do their job and have been muffled for so many years.
Thank you so much for talking to me this morning. You've given me a great insight to the work of InfluenceMap and some really good tips to some of the people that might be listening. So thank you for getting up early and having a chat to me. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dylan Tanner.
No, thank you very much, Kylie. It's been wonderful.
Oh gosh, Dylan is so deeply experienced, and I like the way he makes it so simple. The science is in, the facts are the facts. If you want to score better, do better. And I can hear myself saying that to people. I'm sure I'm going to steal his lines and say that to people. And look, the other thing I really wanted to highlight is I'm going to take his advice. The IPCC is the North Star. That's the only thing we need to look at. I'm going to get that IPCC 5-page summary advice to policymakers and make sure I have a really good read of that and make sure my colleagues do too. It sounds like the one simple best resource going forward.
Yeah, I've got to add that to my bookmarks bar as well. And I thought it was really powerful what he said about how executives simply aren't going to be able to read or even understand every paper that comes out talking about climate. Which they're usually full of graphs and tables and numbers. That just sort of highlights the importance of the things like the 5-page summary from the IPCC. But at the same time, leaders must put more effort into keeping on top of the key climate issues, because when they're asked, and they will be asked, it really behooves them to have a clear, comprehensive position that makes sense and not just sort of spew hollow words out into the ether that mean nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for listening, everyone. Make sure to check out the other episodes in our series. We've got great conversations with some of the brightest minds out there discussing the important issues in the world of social capital. See you next time.
Social Capital Matters has been a production of Baldwin Boyle Group, hosted by Kylie Taylor and produced and edited by Greg Jorgensen. Find more episodes in our ongoing series on baldwinboyle.com/podcasts, watch on YouTube, or listen wherever you find your podcasts.